that you do. So thank you so much. I love your t-shirt. My job is email. That's fantastic.
I felt like it was appropriate. All right, let me
So
real
fair.
quick
Well,
share my screen so I can have that going. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. All right, can everyone see? I'm gonna just keep going until anyone says no.
Great.
Perfect. All right. Hi. So welcome to No Small Parts: How to Ace Your Alt Text. Today we're talking all about alt text. So hi, I'm Sarah Gallardo. I'm a lead email developer and email accessibility specialist at Oracle Digital Experience Agency, where we are just firmly focused on accessibility in emails. I just recently obtained my Trusted Tester certification, which I'm pretty excited about. I'm also CPAC certified, and last year I started a blog all about email accessibility called a11y.email. So this kind of all started with me just wondering, what are people doing about alt text in email? So I turned my images off on Gmail and just let the emails come on rolling in. So these are just some live examples of emails that I've received that I felt like the alt text was absolutely appalling on. We've got a whole range from no alt text to no color contrast to placeholder text. The spacer image is my personal favorite. I have no idea why that needs to be as big as it is. But honestly, the experience of users that need alt text in the email industry right now is horrible. Like, it is really, really bad. These are not rare occurrences. I'd say probably around 90% of the emails that I get in my inbox that I'm looking at do not have appropriate alt text. So this is a big deal, and this is a really big way that we can actually change our industry and make it better. So let's talk about it. So first, what is alternative text? I feel like it's pretty basic, but essentially, like, a computer or a screen reader can't see what's in that image. It is just a collection of pixels. So the alt text is literally telling the person or telling the computer what that image is of. And that's kind of its job, is to communicate whatever that image is. I also want to kind of separate two distinct vocab words here. So a lot of times we talk about alt, we say alt tag and all kinds of different like versions of the word alt. And really there's two distinct differences here. So we have the alt attribute, which is this little block of code that is required to be inside every image element in an HTML file. And then we have the alternative text, which is essentially the value of that alt attribute. So it's the text that we put between those double quotes. So hope that helps. It's okay to use them interchangeably. I mean, it's not okay, but give yourself some grace. I'll probably mess it up at least a couple times during this session. So just keep getting better, keep working on it. So I like to think about who is really using alt text. And I think historically in our industry, people have really focused on people whose images don't load. And that's for a number of different reasons, right? Especially in the pre-Gmail auto download phase of our industry. Maybe you don't have great connection, maybe you have security firewalls set up on your computer or your office that keep those images from loading, or even just down on the email client level. But there's actually a second group of people, and that's people that use assistive technologies. And when we're talking about alt text specifically, we're really mostly focused on screen readers and other text-to-speech software, but there's some variation there. But that's largely kind of who we need to think about when we're writing our alt text. And it's kind of important to know that who is not just people that can't see anything. In fact, most screen reader users are actually people who have low vision or reading disabilities like dyslexia, and even people with cognitive and attention issues like ADHD will use a screen reader to help them focus on their content. So this is not a small use case, this is a pretty substantial use case, and I think it's important that we kind of are aware of that. And we also need to be aware of the fact that only one of these groups of people actually have laws that make sure that they're provided equal access to content. And so that's really critical for us. So, yeah, sure, give some good color contrast, make images not loading still look nice. Yeah, but that's an option. having good alt text is not an option. And I think it's really important we focus on that. Another thing I kind of wanted to talk about is screen readers and screen reader users, and kind of demystify that entire concept, because I think a lot of times we kind of have this kind of fear of it because we haven't experienced it, we haven't played around with it. But a screen reader is just a utility on your screen, like on your computer. There's different screen readers based on different operating systems, but for the most part, their job is to read the content on the screen. It's really pretty cut and dry. You should also know that a lot of them will also add additional keystrokes, key commands, and gestures so that users can have access to the full extent of all of the content that exists, but there's kind of a lot there. I also think it's important, and I know you guys, I've heard this a lot just today on our chat, that it's really important with screen readers to use semantic coding markup. And so that's really kind of one of the main ways that screen readers will actually kind of read a lot of the structural content into those emails. And we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that means in a second. But when it comes to images and alt attributes, I really think everyone needs to understand how bad that experience is when there is not an alt attribute in the image. So after doing some testing, I wanted to just kind of explain this to you guys so that you can have a very good visual on this experience. So generally, an unlinked image, that screen reader will come up to it, and without an alt attribute, it's going to try to pull from the information around that image or that make up that image to be able to describe that to the end user. Like quite literally, they're kind of like, I mean, you're not giving me what I need, so I guess here's the entire image URL of that hosted image. Maybe that'll help. So that's not great. Sometimes it's much easier than that. They might just declare it as an image, or they might read the file name, and it wouldn't be such an awful experience. But the real bad part is a linked image. And you are going to hear about linked images so much today with me. But a linked image without an alt attribute, the screen reader email client combination will frequently read that entire link URL. And that's all the concatenated tracking information, super long link of text that gets read out. And so I have kind of an example here of a URL from a recent image I got. And I think it's important to just think about if it was you or me and the entire first 5 lines of an email was just gobbledygook, you're not going to keep reading. Like, honestly, you're going to be like, okay, there's nothing for me here. You guys are weird. I'm going to move on to a different email that actually has content in it I can read. So my first rule of alt text is that every image in an email must have an alt attribute, like period, end of story. You've got to put that alt in there. Then I think it's important to kind of talk about some best practices. And so these are kind of like just some guidelines. I'm not going to call them rules because you can kind of adjust some of this depending on your content. So the first rule, or the first guideline, is to match the content. Quite literally, the image and the alt text need to be communicating the same thing. Pretty straightforward. You also want to be short and sweet. Excuse me. Sorry, you want to be short and sweet and communicate that content in the least number of words possible. So sorry. And that's because of these character limits. A lot of screen readers will actually stop reading alt text at about 100 to 120 characters. And so we need to kind of be mindful of that very focused amount of space for alt text. And you also want to consider the context. It's not just the image itself. In fact, different images in different contexts are going to be communicating different things. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's a pretty critical one. I also think it's important to understand how screen readers are reading that content to users. So they're not going to, like, you don't need to include image of or graphic of. That's part of that structural content that the screen reader is going to read to users and communicate to them. So a lot of times it will say image and then read the alt text. That order can be a little different in different settings. And of course, you do need to match color contrast and make sure that you're meeting that color contrast requirement when the images are turned off. Because as much as we're not really focusing on those people that turn their images off in this session, there is an overlap between people that have their images off and people that are colorblind, just because the colorblind population is so large. So it's important to kind of know that and pay attention to it in dark mode as well. Also, don't match case. Designers love to put things in all caps. We don't want our alt text to be in all caps. So if you've got text on your image, I don't like that, but if you do, make sure that you're writing your alt text in sentence case or title case or something that's legible. Also, this is a big rule. Don't be redundant. We don't want to repeat content as much as we possibly can. We want to communicate our information succinctly and not repeat ourselves over and over again. That's a horrible experience for everyone. Also, some developer tips. This is mostly from emails that have come across my screen or have come across my desk that I wanted to share. So we don't want to code in any non-standard ways. There really isn't a lot of reason for this anymore, but I think there's, maybe some legacy code that might still exist in some of our libraries that we need to look out for. But we're just coding an image element. We're wrapping it in an anchor tag. That's it. Nothing fancy. Kind of connected to that, we're not going to put a transparent image on top of a background image to provide a background image with alt text. Like you can do that, but it really can cause a lot of confusion. And that also kind of puts you into the world of using VML, and I don't like using VML for accessibility related reasons too. Same with hiding text in your email. There's really not a lot of support there. And when we were talking about screen readers and how many different screen readers there are, and we all know how many different email clients there are, when you start multiplying that and it becomes like a very large number, there's no tangible way that we can test to make sure that that works in every situation. So if you're going to do it, just be very cautious of that. All right, so let's talk about the actual content inside our alt text. We really have two things that we want to think about. We want to think about the content, what the image is actually communicating, and the context, which is all the information around the image that kind of supports the image's communication, right? So when we're talking about content, my big question is, what is that image doing? What is it communicating that is different than anything near it? So webaim.org actually has this really great kind of division of different image types, these kind of different categories that we can use to kind of determine where we need our alt text to go. And I feel like it's really useful. So let's talk about it. Images of text. I'm starting here because this one is pretty obvious. If you have images of text, that text needs to be represented in the alt attribute, right? That's pretty easy. I think it's really important to also know that we don't need or want to include a bunch of extraneous details, specifically like font choices, color choices, design aesthetics really don't need to be communicated here unless it's relevant. So an example of something that would be relevant, if you sell fonts and you're sending an email about fonts and you have an image that has font things in it, then you would write alt text that describes the fonts. Does that make sense? So it's really about what that image is communicating to the user, and that there can be some like word choices and styling that can support that, but we kind of just need to make sure that we're communicating effectively and as efficiently as possible. Also, you don't have to go super granular here. If you have an image that has a small bit of text in it that isn't relevant, like my best example is a group photo and someone's wearing a shirt with a tagline. You don't need to write down what that tagline is unless it is actually relevant to the end user, again. So I'm including this kind of common example that I feel like we get in our emails often. I see them in my inbox, I see them in the work that I do. Someone has designed this really spiffy block of text to look nice. And you're kind of stuck in this place where if you want it to render perfectly, it has to be an image. But that's a horrible idea. And I think we all know that. So my first suggestion when this stuff comes across your desk is to push back, raise your hand, advocate for users with disabilities and say, hey, let's make this live text instead. We can use a background gradient. We can use a border radius. And yeah, it's not going to look perfect everywhere, but it's going to be a much better experience for all users. So that's, priority number one, get it to live text if you can't. And there's a lot of different pressures on us and a lot of different decisions that are made that have nothing to do with us and our preferences or desires. If it has to be an image, then my kind of next best solution would be to kind of slice it into 100 or 120 characters. And again, we're not going crazy here. We're not dividing by word or line. We're just chunking, right? So that we're kind of meeting as much of that content as we can. Will you have trouble with white lines in Outlook and Gmail? Possibly, use that divide by 4 that Jay was just telling us. And that would be probably the next best solution. And then I have like a third best solution, which is rearranging the content in the alt text. And I'm just going to tell you that is something we can do. We can rearrange the alt text in our in our code to make sure that it is prioritized to that first 120 characters. So the most important parts of that block of text are in the part that gets read. And then I would also kind of combine that with having the landing page, wherever the spy now click-through is taking us, making sure that landing page has this information in an accessible way would also really help here. But again, live text, best solution, and then those other ones. So images of text, pretty straightforward. Decorative images, I think, are also really pretty straightforward, and I think there's a lot of benefit to kind of talking about them. So they can really be a couple of different things. We see them a lot as spacer images or transitional design elements. Basically, a decorative image is when you ask that question, what is this image doing? And the answer is not really anything, actually. So then we want to use an empty alt attribute. A lot of times we call that null value. And so I think the spacers and the transitional design elements are pretty standard and make sense. But we also have this issue where we have an image and then we have adjacent live text. And essentially your alt text for that image would probably be the live text next to it, right? Like that the alt text for that yellow teapot would probably be yellow teapot, right? Or this lifestyle image is maybe not actually adding any value for your users. It's just kind of there for visual effects to kind of pull out the design so it's not a big block of text, right? So these would all be good examples of using a decorative image and having that empty alt attribute. I'm also going to say, maybe just go into your libraries, go ahead and remove any spacer image or placeholder or FPO in your decorative images, just so you don't have that really embarrassing image spacer block. So then we move from decorative to informative images. And informative images are essentially the opposite of a decorative image, right? So when we ask, what does this image do? It is actually communicating something important to us. And so we need to make sure that that content is represented in the alt text. So I like this mask example because I feel like I've seen sloppy stuff come in before where maybe, you're pressed for time or nobody's paying attention. So you just write blah, 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 put your mask on correctly. Okay, sure. You send it off, you don't think twice about it. But that's not actually what this instructional image is communicating to us. It is actually telling us exactly how to put that mask on correctly and how not to put that mask on correctly. And so that does need to be represented in the alt text in order for it to give that same experience to each screen reader user. So I think that's really kind of important. And then I'm also calling out here, we've got the same images that were decorative images in the last slide are informative images here. To just kind of point out that there is some nuance between these two. Is that not actually a yellow teapot? Will my newsletter recipients for fancy teapot aficionados be able to look at that teapot and be like, wow, that's not just any yellow teapot. That is a very specific teapot. Then we want to make sure that we're representing that in the alt text as well. Same with lifestyle images. Lifestyle images can just spruce up a design, but they can also communicate emotional connectivity, specifics. Like, for instance, if this lady and her student were doing sign language, maybe that would be a relevant piece of information to give the user so that they would understand, oh, I can also use sign language at the school or whatever. So informative images, I think, are pretty interesting. Then we have complex images and groups of images. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we don't see them very often, but a complex image, put simply, is if you were going to try to write that content in 120 characters, you could not and have it make sense. It just would not work. So in that case, we want to use that null value again, and then provide a link, an external link to a more accessible solution. Maybe that's a video, audio, description, whatever that might be. Maybe it's just a web page that has this information in a more accessible way. Same with group of images. We don't see these as often in email anymore because we're no longer slicing the heck out of an image to get it to render correctly. But when we have a group of images, we want to make sure that we are kind of communicating the whole of that visual. So example with these stars, like, again, maybe if you're lazy or not paying attention or don't know any better, you're going to just say star, 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 half a star, which is not very helpful. Are we going to really make people add stars? Probably not. So the better solution would be to make the last 4 of those stars a null attribute, and then write the first one to actually say 3.5 stars so that we have that very clearly communicated. All right. So here's where things get a little exciting and interesting, and this is functional images. So a functional image is an image that is linked. So every image that is linked has to describe where that link is going. This is like a WCAG criteria. It's super important. So if every linked image has to explain where it's going, then any image that we link in an email must have alt text, and that alt text must also describe where that link is going. So don't get too literal here. We're not like writing out the URL. You know, you could totally use the same kind of CTA that you would use on a button here. And you have the added benefit of having all of that content be connected together. So instead of just, go buy this product, you can kind of have a little bit more description there. And this is also kind of how we get into kind of a bigger story in email accessibility, where we're talking about really trying to reduce the number of links that we're putting on content. And that has a lot of like legitimate accessibility, like access related issues, but it also has some ease of our process that we're not writing awful alt text for everything, that we can kind of pare that down and be a little more focused and intentional. So this is another one of my hard and fast rules, that every linked image in an email must have alt text that describes the link destination. So that is just super, super important. 2 things that you have to know. So I do want to also talk about context. So this is like, what is the information around this image, and how does that text relate to that image? And so I have a pretty common product stack where we've got an image of a product, the name of the product, the description of the product, and a CTA. We can complain about that CTA being not great, but for the purposes of this example, I didn't want to go too crazy. So in this case, if we're looking at this image, we would probably give that image the alt attribute of the product name that is right underneath it. And so when a screen reader encounters this piece of content, they're going to get name of the product, description, and CTA. And so that's redundant, and we want to try to avoid that if we can. So in this case, this image is essentially a decorative image because it's not giving us any additional information. So we can use that null value. Likewise, we've changed something. It's a minor thing, but in the description, we're no longer calling out that this is a sulfate-free product. But in that image, it says it's sulfate-free, which means that image is now an informative image. It is telling us something important. So now we need to make sure that that is represented in the alt text. And because of the order of this one, I don't want to just say sulfate-free. I actually kind of want to, slightly cross the line into redundancy here, but I think it's going to be a better experience for the user to have the name of the product and then the text that's on the screen. So these last 2 images were not linked, and so they're pretty easy, straightforward. But once we get into a linked image, then we also, again, have to include that link destination. So here I'm just borrowing that existing CTA. You could change it up. You could absolutely say, buy fancy face serum now, or however you need to. I'm not a copywriter, I always say that. But you can kind of change that up a little bit as long as you're also including that link destination, right? But I do want to call out, there's a really excellent solution in the techniques document for the WCAG that talks about this. And it's technique H2, but it's basically, we can wrap an image and text that's adjacent to it in a link. And that can provide that accessible name. So it does the same job as the alt text, but that text that's being read is actually the product name. So then we can keep that image as a decorative image because it's not giving us any additional information, and still be able to link that image, which is one of our goals in email. We want to link everything. But you can also have that text in there that provides that additional context for users. So this is something that I've been implementing in a lot of our modular systems lately, just to kind of have this already built in. Granted, you still have to pay attention to write the content in the description, the content in the image, but kind of wrapping those together makes it just a little bit easier. I'm also going to call out that this doesn't work very well in a horizontal mockup. So this vertical mockup is probably the best place for it. Totally open to someone solving the horizontal mockup if you can do it. But this is kind of the baseline, what I like to do. So 4 things that I feel like I absolutely want you to take with you after this session. One is that you are always putting that alt attribute into your images. It is everywhere. You don't even look at images that don't have an alt attribute, right? It's always there. You also want to communicate that image content. What that image is communicating is what that alt text needs to be communicating. Super simple. And then you need to know that linked images must have alt text that describes the link destination. It is so critical to have that. Remember that big gobbledygook of the concatenated URL? We need linked images to have that alt text. Super important. And also, you've got to consider where that image is going, what that content looks like, or what is the context around that image in order to help better understand what the user needs from that alt text. So, all right, thank you guys. I am now going to be on a completely different screen. Where is everyone? Okay, there we go. Hi.
Hello. That was so informative. I always learn so much reading your blog. And this especially just brought so many things to life that I wasn't aware of. You also have a ton of questions in the chat. I think we can get through maybe 1 or 2 of them. The one that's sitting at the top right now is, what's the best way to write alt text for an animated GIF? Do you need to identify it as an animation?
So yes, an animated GIF, super important. That's a really good point. Since you're talking about essentially, like, we've got the slides within that animated GIF, you do need to make sure that all of that content is in that animated GIF, or in the alt text for that animated GIF. Sometimes that might mean that you need to kind of rethink how that animated GIF works. And you can also kind of stack it appropriately, right? Like, I always love this silly animated GIF of like an envelope opening that has, some sort of invitation inside of it. So in that case, you would want to make sure that the most important information, which is, the dates and times and the invitation, is going to be in that top 120 characters.
And then one more question from Logan. Where did you get that t-shirt? I think that's a great way to finish off your presentation. Where can we buy one?
I think it's Raygun t-shirts. I should know this because I'm subscribed to their emails, but I think it's Raygun. But someone on the Women of Email group brought it up, and I was like, yes, I must have that because it's great.
Yes. It's a fantastic t-shirt. I will be buying one for myself right after this. Well, thank you so much again for coming out and sharing all this amazing knowledge that you have on accessibility. I would highly encourage you to drop into the Q&A because there's so many questions there for where can people get certified, where can people read more about accessibility, and I'm sure they would love to know. But yeah, thank you again.